They told you America was built by Europeans. That's cute. Europeans drafted the blueprint, but the hands, minds, and souls that built this land, they came from Africa, from kingdoms that already had cities before Europe had plumbing, from tribes that carried science, rhythm, and spirit across the Atlantic, not as slaves, but as stolen kings. Let's be real, every schoolbook starts the black story in chains. But that's not the beginning. That's the cover-up. Because before the plantations, before the auction blocks, there were empires: Mali, Benin, Kongo, Ashanti, Yoruba, Great Zimbabwe. Civilization so advanced that European traders came begging for gold, knowledge, and roots. These weren't nameless tribes, these were nations. And when those nations were fractured, their descendants carried fragments of those worlds right into the soil of America. But here's the betrayal. They didn't just steal bodies. They stole identities. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't just human trafficking, it was a cultural heist. Each ship was a vault full of architects, engineers, healers, griots, drummers, astronomers, stripped of names, branded as property, and renamed Negro. The plan was to erase the tribes, erase the languages, erase the memory, so no one could trace the roots. Because roots give power. Still, the roots remembered. Picture it. West Africa. 1400s. The Kongo Kingdom ruled by Mbanza Kongo, with stone cathedrals and organized streets before Jamestown even existed. The Mali Empire, once led by Mansa Musa, the richest man in recorded history, trading gold so pure it rewired economies. In Benin, artists carved bronze heads so detailed that European experts swore Africans couldn't have made them, so they called them mystery art. And across the Atlantic, these same people, their descendants, would become the backbone of American agriculture, architecture, and music. That ain't coincidence. That's heritage under disguise. See, the so-called lost tribes weren't lost by accident. They were hidden, intentionally buried under new names: Gullah, Maroon, Creole, Afro-Carolinian, Black Seminole. Each one a living echo of an African nation. Each one proof that culture doesn't die, it mutates, survives, and speaks through rhythm, food, faith, and rebellion. You ever wonder how the drum survived the Middle Passage? How songs of sorrow turned into gospel, blues, jazz, and hip-hop? That's lineage talking. The polyrhythms of Yoruba, the call and response of the Congo, the storytelling of the griot, all reborn in the fields of the South. Even the shouts and dances in the praise house? Straight out of Africa. But America rebranded it as Negro spirituals, stripped of origin so the people wouldn't know their own genius. The truth hits harder when you realize the plan wasn't just slavery, it was amnesia. To make sure the stolen didn't know what they came from. Because once you forget who you were, they can convince you to be anything. And yet the evidence refuses to stay buried. Anthropologists whisper about African rice cultivation methods showing up in South Carolina, identical to techniques from Sierra Leone. Linguists find Bantu words living in Gullah dialects. Archaeologists dig up cowrie shells and ritual carvings in Georgia. Swamps, same as those found along the Kongo River. You start connecting dots. And suddenly, America's DNA looks a whole lot more African than the textbooks ever admit. Ask yourself, why does this matter? Because identity is power. And for 400 years, the most powerful thing stolen from black people wasn't freedom, it was the origin story. Now imagine flipping that script. Imagine tracing every beat of a drum, every swing of a hammer, every whisper of resistance, all the way back to its African source. The way a griot traces lineage in song. The way ancestors whisper through rhythm. The story of America would never look the same again. Because if the lost tribes of Africa helped shape America, then America itself is an African creation in disguise. And that means the story of this land, its culture, its innovation, its spirit, doesn't start with the Pilgrims. It starts on the mother continent, but here's where the twist comes in. Some of those tribes didn't just influence early America. Some of them arrived before Columbus, and their fingerprints are still in the soil. So the real question is, if the tribes weren't truly lost, just renamed, rebranded, and rewritten, what else about America's origin story has been flipped upside down? Let's pull the curtain back. Because if America's roots trace back to Africa, then we gotta ask, which Africa are we talking about? Not the broken, colonized image they show you in documentaries, you know, the one with dusty huts and sad music. Nah, I'm talking about the Africa that had libraries before Europe had literacy. The Africa that mapped the stars when Europe was still debating if the Earth was flat. The Africa that taught the world how to build, farm, pray, and heal. That's the hidden source, the mother code.C. When we talk about the lost tribes, we're not talking about some mythical people wandering through the desert. We're talking about real nations with bloodlines, economies, and philosophies, the ones whose children were stolen and planted in American soil like seeds. Seeds that grew into something new, something unstoppable. Take the Manding people, masters of metallurgy, navigation, and trade. Long before Europeans ever dreamed of new worlds, Manding sailors rode the Atlantic currents westward. Historians whisper that fleets from Mali reached the Americas in the 1300s, carrying gold, griots, and the pulse of Africa across the sea. When Columbus arrived, he didn't discover anything. He stumbled into an echo of Africa already in motion. Or look at the Yoruba, from what's now Nigeria, priests of rhythm and order. Their belief system wasn't superstition. It was science dressed in spirit. They studied energy, vibration, alignment, concepts modern physics is still catching up to. When Yoruba people were taken into slavery, their spirituality traveled with them, disguised under new names: Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, Vodun in Haiti. In America, that same current slipped into gospel jazz and the Holy Ghost. They tried to burn the roots, but the fire just spread. And the Kongo Kingdom. Oh, that's when they really tried to erase. Congo was a Christian nation before most of Europe was done burning witches. King Zinga Nkuwu converted in 1491, not because of colonial pressure, but because he saw divinity as universal. The Kongo people fused African cosmology with biblical teachings and created something new, a theology of freedom. When Congo captives reached Virginia and the Carolinas, they brought that same spirit of liberation. Every rebellion, from the Stono Uprising to the Gullah Wars, carried Congo fingerprints. These weren't random coincidences. They were survival codes, embedded memories. The Gullah Geechee along the southeastern coast still speak a language laced with West African syntax. Their basket weaving, identical to Wolof and Mandé traditions. Their rice cultivation, a perfect replica of Sierra Leonean systems. And when enslaved Africans saw the swamps and lowlands of Carolina, they recognized the land, the same humidity, same soil, same rhythm. They didn't just survive. They rooted. But here's where it gets deep. America didn't just absorb African culture. It built itself on it. Agricultural techniques, architecture, cuisine, music, all lifted from the tribes they called primitive. Enslaved Africans taught white planters how to cultivate rice, indigo, and cotton efficiently. They designed drainage systems and irrigation canals still studied by engineers today. They cooked with spices, oils, and techniques that turned survival food into soul food. That same food America now calls Southern cuisine. They were forced to build a nation, but they couldn't help but rebuild Africa in the process. Now pause on that, because it changes everything. If Africa's tribes provided the cultural software, then America was the stolen hardware it ran on. Everything from the way we praise to the way we play carries African code. The syncopation in the blues, the ring shout in church, the defiance in hip-hop, It's all the same rhythm, the same rebellion, just updated for the times. The spirit of the Yoruba, the Kongo, the Manding, reborn through each generation. But let's not romanticize it. The erasure was violent. Colonial scholars rewrote maps and renamed tribes to blur the line between ancestry and property. They turned Mandé into Mandingo, Yoruba into fetish cults, and Kongo into savages. Because the truth was dangerous if Africans were civilized, intelligent, spiritual, and powerful, then the justification for slavery collapsed. So they built an entire myth to cover the receipts. You ever notice how history only starts talking about Africans after they're enslaved? Like we appeared out of thin air, already shackled? That's by design. Because if they showed the full picture, empires, trade routes, universities, it would have made Europe look like the student, not the teacher. And that's the part they could never allow. A world where black excellence wasn't an exception, but the origin dot. So when we say the lost tribes of Africa shaped America, we're not just talking about influence. We're talking about identity theft on a continental scale. The enslavers didn't just take people, they took credit. But what happens when the truth resurfaces? When the descendants of those tribes start recognizing the signatures of their ancestors in language, music, even DNA? What happens when we realize the lost tribes were never lost, just waiting to be found in us? You ever notice how history feels like a movie with half the scenes missing? That's what happens when the winners edit the script. They cut out the characters that don't fit their version, especially the ones with black skin and African names. But the receipts are still there, scattered across time like broken glass. And when you start piecing them together, the reflection is undeniable. Africa was never missing. It was deleted. Let's start with the records they didn't expect us to find. In 1526, long before Jamestown, a Spanish expedition brought enslaved Africans to what's now South Carolina. But here's the twist. Those Africans revolted and disappeared into the wilderness. Historians call it the first slave rebellion on American soil. But it wasn't rebellion. It was return. Those Africans melted into the land, linking up with indigenous nations, the Gullah, the Yamasee, the Seminole. And just like that, a new people emerged, the Black Seminoles, descendants of Africans and Native Americans who refused to bow to either empire or plantation. That's one missing piece. Another, language. When enslavers split up tribes, they thought they could erase communication. But Africans were fluent in survival. They built new tongues, Creole, Patois, Gullah, hybrid languages loaded with African grammar under English disguise. Linguists now trace over 30 West African linguistic markers in early African American speech. Even the way we flip words, stretch syllables, and drop rhythm into sentences, that's ancient African syntax dancing in American mouths. Every ain't, every finna, every double negative was a rebellion in grammar. And it wasn't just words. Names carried secret meanings too. Cuffy, from Kofi, born on Friday. Phyllis, from Felicia, meaning loved one. Pompey, Quash, Kojo, all African names preserved under slave registers. Every time a plantation roll call echoed through the fields, Africa answered back, quietly, but powerfully. Then, there's the hidden craftsmanship. Look at early American architecture, the coastal houses of South Carolina and Georgia, the brickwork patterns, the layout of gardens, even the way porches are designed for airflow. Those techniques didn't come from England. They came from West African builders who understood tropical climates and humidity. The low country plantation system itself was a remix of African rice economies, complete with irrigation ditches identical to those. Along the Niger Delta, America didn't just use African labor. It used African blueprints. But the most haunting missing piece? Religion. See, the enslavers tried to baptize the spirit out of the people. They banned drums, outlawed rituals, and rewrote scripture. But the tribes found ways to hide their gods in plain sight. In the hush harbors, those secret night gatherings in the woods, Africans fused Old Testament fire with Yoruba cosmology. Moses became Ogun, the liberator. The Holy Spirit became a current of Shango's thunder. And the shout, that trembling dance in the church aisles? That's straight out of the Bantu ring shout, the oldest African worship form on record. By the time the world saw the black church, it was already an evolved African temple, dressed in Christian robes. A spiritual rebellion so powerful that even white preachers started copying the rhythm, the call and response, the fire, the feeling. They stole the sermon style the same way they stole the labor. And still, most Americans don't know that those lost tribes carried their entire cosmology here, disguised as prayer, song, and survival. But maybe the most tragic missing piece is how Africa's descendants fought for freedom before America even called itself a nation. The Stono Rebellion in 1739, led by Kongo warriors. The 1811 German Coast Uprising in Louisiana, Africans trained in strategy, using military formations from Dahomey. Every rebellion was a callback to home, to the tactics and courage taught by kingdoms that knew war and refused chains. So when they call black Americans lost, they're lying again. Because how can you be lost when your fingerprints are on every foundation of the place you live? From the food to the faith, from the rhythm to the rebellion, every piece of America hums with African code. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. When those pieces started to reveal themselves, the system panicked. The colonizers didn't just erase Africa once, they kept erasing it again and again. Through science, through religion, through education. And the real question becomes, if they worked this hard to bury the evidence, what truth were they so afraid of us finding? They told you civilization began in Greece. That's the bedtime story, polite, clean, and European approved. But the receipts say otherwise. Long before Plato dreamed, Africans were calculating the stars, splitting stone with geometry, and writing their own history in granite. Africa wasn't learning from the world was learning from Africa. Start with Kemet, ancient Egypt. Not the Hollywood Egypt with pale pharaohs and British accents, but the real one, a black civilization rooted along the Nile, built by Nubians from the south. Their word for themselves, KMT, literally meant the Black Land. That wasn't about soil. That was about people. And from those people came the foundation of math, medicine, architecture, and spirituality, the same systems Greece and Rome later claimed as their own. You want receipts? Imhotep, the world's first recorded scientist, physician, and architect, was an African man designing step pyramids while Europe was still carving caves. The Greeks later renamed him Aesculapius, called him a god of medicine, and quietly erased his African origin. Even Pythagoras, the so-called father of mathematics, studied in Egyptian temples for 22 years before he ever drew a triangle. He didn't invent geometry. He borrowed it, dressed it in Greek, and the textbooks followed suit. Move west, to Mali. By the 1300s, Timbuktu had more students in its universities than most European cities had people. Sankara University housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, law, philosophy, and medicine. These weren't tribal tales. They were scientific treatises, written proof that Africa was producing scholars, economists, and theologians centuries before Europe escaped its own dark ages. And what about Mansa Musa? They say Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are rich. That's cute. Mansa Musa made them look like broke tourists. His wealth was so vast it crashed economies. But it wasn't just gold. It was infrastructure, art, and diplomacy. He funded libraries, funded trade, and carried Islam and intellect across the continent. And when he traveled to Mecca, the whole world took notice. That was the moment the myth of Africa's backwardness started to fracture, and Europe started watching with envy. Now go south. Great Zimbabwe. Stone walls 36 feet high, carved without mortar, aligned to solar paths. Archaeologists couldn't believe Africans built it. So they made up a lie, said it was built by ancient Arabs. It took a century for the world to admit that black Africans created that architecture themselves. Because to acknowledge that would mean accepting Africa as the origin of complex civilization. And that truth was too dangerous for colonial textbooks. Here's the part that stings. They didn't just steal artifacts, they stole credit. Egypt became Middle Eastern. Ethiopia became mystical. West Africa became tribal. That's how they rewrote the narrative, by shifting Africa's borders, until even Africans didn't recognize themselves in their own history. But America's roots? They're tangled in this same erasure. The African captives who came here weren't from nowhere. They came from these civilizations, from families who read, built, healed, and traded. So when they reached the shores of the New World, they carried with them the world's oldest knowledge: astronomy, metallurgy, medicine, rhythm, and survival. America's story starts with that inheritance, whether the textbooks want to admit it or not. The plantations might have stripped titles and crowns, but you can't enslave memory. That's why African knowledge reappeared in coded ways, through crops, through songs, through structure. You see it in the rice fields, the folk medicine, even the oral storytelling that became blues and hip-hop. The foundation of African civilization never died. It shapeshifted. And when Europe finally crawled out of its dark ages, who do you think held the lantern? The Moors, African descendants of those same civilizations. They crossed the Mediterranean not as conquerors of chaos, but as teachers of light. They reintroduced sanitation, mathematics, and art to a continent that had forgotten dot. So let's call it what it is. Africa wasn't the world's student. Africa was the world's professor, the syllabus of civilization itself. But when Europe took the stage, they didn't just want to learn. They wanted to replace the source. And that leads us to the next revelation. The moment Africa's brilliance became Europe's obsession. Because once you know who taught who, you gotta ask, what made Europe so desperate to rewrite the story? Europe didn't rewrite Africa's story out of ignorance. They did it out of strategy. When a student wants to become a master, the first thing they do is silence the teacher. That's exactly what Europe did. The timeline tells on them. Around the 1400s, Europe was broke, sick, and scrambling. The Moors had just been expelled from Spain after 700 years of rule. 7 centuries of African brilliance, algebra, medicine, architecture, philosophy, suddenly forced underground. Europe watched its light source walk out the door. And instead of gratitude, they chose revenge. They launched a new era, the Age of Discovery. But that's just the polite term for the age of theft. Portugal and Spain started sending ships down Africa's coast, not to explore, but to extract. Gold, ivory, bodies, it didn't matter. What mattered was profit and power. To justify the brutality, they had to invent a myth. Africans were primitive, Europe was civilized, and God was white. That's how the lie was born. See, propaganda isn't just pictures, it's policy. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the Dum Diversas, a papal bull authorizing Portugal to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate all non-Christian peoples. Translation? Go get that African wealth and call it divine will. That one document turned genocide into gospel. And once the Vatican blessed it, the rest of Europe followed. Every time an African kingdom rose, Europe found a way to label it a myth. When they saw the gold of Mali, they called it exaggeration. When they saw Great Zimbabwe's stone cities, they blamed Arabs. When they read the manuscripts of Timbuktu, they said, "No way Africans wrote this." It wasn't about proof, it was about control. Because to keep a people oppressed, you have to erase the evidence that they were ever free. So they built new sciences to make the lies look official. Anthropology, chronometry, phrenology. fake fields designed to measure African inferiority. They drew skulls, not to learn, but to label. They turned racism into research. And just like that, the descendants of pharaohs and scholars were reduced to savages in the textbooks. But here's the slickest move. They didn't just rewrite Africa. They rewrote time itself. They redated monuments, mistranslated hieroglyphs, and renamed artifacts. They even created new civilizations in the history books, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, and placed them at the center, leaving Africa as a footnote. The irony? Those civilizations all learned from Africa. Greece studied in Egypt. Rome stole from Greece. And by the time the Renaissance hit, Europe was basically plagiarizing Africa's homework and getting full credit. The motive was always economic. Whoever controlled history controlled destiny. By making Africa the beginner instead of the origin, they justified colonization. If Africa was uncivilized, then stealing from it was charity. If Africans were savages, then slavery was salvation. That's the mental math they sold to the world. And that lie built an empire by the 1600s. European nations were running the biggest human trafficking operation in history. Over 12 million Africans stolen, millions more murdered, entire societies dismantled. And through it all, they kept printing the same propaganda. Africans as less than human, Europe as the savior. Because if they ever admitted the truth, the whole system would collapse. You ever wonder why they still call Africa developing, while Europe drowns in debt and decay? That's the residue of the rewrite. Colonialism didn't just steal land, it rewired perception. It made the thief look like the hero and the victim look like the problem. But now the receipts are resurfacing. DNA, archaeology, art, all pointing back to Africa as the origin. The lie is crumbling. And the question that terrifies the world is simple. If Africa was first, and Africa taught the world, then what does that make Europe? The student or the imposter? Because once the mask slips, the whole narrative shifts. And when image becomes the weapon, the next question is, who's holding the trigger? They didn't need to keep the chains on your wrists once they locked your reflection in a cage. That's the genius of image control. It doesn't just shape what you see, it shapes what you believe. Europe understood that early. After centuries of studying Africa, learning from Africa, and stealing from Africa, they figured out the final weapon wasn't the sword, it was the story. Whoever controls the story controls the soul. That's why, right after the Moors were pushed out of Spain, you started seeing a pattern. Portraits darkened into shadow, saints repainted pale. Kings rewritten as conquerors instead of collaborators. Art became the battlefield. The mission was clear: make whiteness divine and blackness disposable. You ever wonder why every holy figure in the West suddenly looked European? Jesus, Mary, the angels, all blonde, blue-eyed, soft-lit. Meanwhile, the original texts from Ethiopia, Nubia, and Coptic Egypt described them as bronze, burnt, and wool-haired. The first Christian empire was in Africa, not Europe. The earliest icons found in catacombs showed dark skin and African features. But Europe couldn't rule a world that worshipped black divinity. So they did what colonizers do best: they repainted God. This wasn't just religion. It was psychological warfare. Once they convinced the world that holiness was white, they didn't have to prove black inferiority. It was already baked into the image. The paintbrush became the whip. Every painting, every statue, every stained glass window whispered the same lie: God looks like your oppressor. And the effect? Generational hypnosis. Kids grew up praying to their own erasure. Whole nations bowed to a face that never resembled theirs. It's one thing to conquer land. It's another to conquer imagination. The same trick played out in education. Early American schools showed Africa as a jungle, its people swinging from vines, no cities, no scholars, no pyramids. They cut the Moors out of European history, They made Egyptian mean foreign, not African. They taught that civilization moved from Europe to Africa, when the truth ran in the opposite direction. By the time photography and cinema came along, the damage was complete. The lens replaced the brush, but the agenda stayed the same. Black people became side characters, servants, slaves, never the scientists, kings, or inventors they actually were. Hollywood sealed the deal. Every ancient story remade with white actors. Every African epic turned into a white savior tale. Even Cleopatra, a descendant of African queens, became Elizabeth Taylor in eyeliner. Control the image, control the mind. It's simple psychology. If you can rewrite how a people see themselves, you don't have to chain them. They'll chain each other. That's why enslavers banned drums, banned reading, banned African languages. Not because they feared violence, because they feared memory. The drum was a phone line to the ancestors. The language carried philosophy. The stories carried code. If those survived, so would identity. And identity breeds resistance. Even in the Americas, that visual warfare continued. Think of minstrel shows, white men painting their faces black, mocking the very people whose culture they stole. That was ritualized humiliation disguised as entertainment. The caricature replaced the truth. But here's the plot twist. The images didn't die, they just went underground. African spirituality hid inside gospel. African royalty reappeared in blues swagger. African power lived in rhythm, in posture, in style. You can suppress the mirror, but the reflection keeps fighting to be seen. Now look at today. Media still plays the same game. They'll glorify Africa when it's exotic or wild, but ignore it when it's advanced. They'll celebrate black culture, the slang, the fashion, the music, while silencing the history behind it. Same control, new technology, but once you see the manipulation, you can't unsee it. The paint cracks. The pixels glitch. The old gods start looking familiar again. So ask yourself, if image has been used for centuries to shape belief, what happens when black people start painting, filming, and framing themselves again? Because the moment you reclaim the image, you reclaim the narrative. And that's what terrifies power the most, a mirror that tells the truth. What terrified Europe wasn't Africa's darkness, it was Africa's light. They saw a continent that could build empires, chart stars, and master metal while Europe was still clawing through feudal mud. That's not ignorance, that's intimidation. Europe's fear wasn't born from hate at first. It was born from inferiority. When Portuguese sailors first reached the West African coast, they didn't find savages. They found organized cities, literate rulers, armies with discipline, and trade systems older than their own monarchies. The diaries of those explorers read like confessions. Awe turned to envy, and envy turned to fear. That fear hardened into strategy. The European mind realized something dangerous. You can't compete with Africa as an equal. You have to redefine the game. So they created a new rulebook. Instead of trying to match Africa's civilization, they declared Africa uncivilized. They made their weakness look like superiority. The true terror came from contact with the Moors. For centuries, African Moors ruled parts of Spain and Portugal, teaching science, medicine, and architecture. The Europeans learned under them, studied their texts, borrowed their systems, even copied their styles. But once the Moors fell, Europe faced a mirror it couldn't stand. The people they had learned from were now labeled as infidels and outsiders. To erase the shame, Europe flipped the script, painted itself as the teacher, Africa as the pupil. That fear bled into religion. European theologians saw African kingdoms practicing Christianity and Islam before them and panicked. If Africans were already spiritual, already advanced, then the European mission to civilize the world had no purpose. So they weaponized faith, turned salvation into a sales pitch. turned light versus darkness into a racial metaphor, and it worked for centuries, but the cracks kept showing. European traders noticed Africans using compasses and maps centuries before discovery. They saw astronomers tracking planetary motion from Timbuktu observatories. They saw healers using herbs that modern pharmacology still relies on. It scared them because it exposed their lie. If the uncivilized already knew science, then what was Europe selling? That's why they burned libraries. Sankar, Gao, Zhen, centuries of knowledge turned to ash. Not by accident, on purpose. Because those manuscripts held the proof that Africa wasn't in the dark. Europe was that, you see. Fear is the foundation of domination. Europe feared the day Africa would remember itself. Because memory leads to unity, and unity leads to power. That's why they broke families, tribes, and languages during slavery. They knew that one word in Wolof, one drumbeat in Yoruba, one prayer in Kongo could wake an entire people from hypnosis. Even today, the system runs on that same fear. Every time Africa rises, every time the diaspora connects, the world shakes. Look at history. Every black movement that preached self-knowledge was targeted. Haiti, Garvey, Panthers, civil rights. It's not the guns that scare them. It's the memory. Because deep down, Europe knows something it can't admit. The teacher is still alive. The descendants of the Moors, of Mali, of Kemet, of Congo, they're still here, speaking, building, creating. And the minute we stop believing their version of history, their control dissolves. That's what they're afraid of, not rebellion, but recognition. The day black people see themselves not as victims of history, but as authors of it. So ask yourself, if fear built the empire, what happens when the fear flips sides? What happens when Africa stops flinching and Europe starts remembering who taught it how to stand? What terrified Europe wasn't Africa's darkness, it was Africa's light. They saw a continent that could build empires, chart stars, and master metal while Europe was still clawing through feudal mud. That's not ignorance, that's intimidation. Europe's fear wasn't born from hate at first. It was born from inferiority. When Portuguese sailors first reached the West African coast, they didn't find savages. They found organized cities, literate rulers, armies with discipline, and trade systems older than their own monarchies. The diaries of those explorers read like confessions. Awe turned to envy, and envy turned to fear. That fear hardened into strategy. The European mind realized something dangerous. You can't compete with Africa as an equal. You have to redefine the game. So they created a new rulebook. Instead of trying to match Africa's civilization, they declared Africa uncivilized. They made their weakness look like superiority. The true terror came from contact with the Moors. For centuries, African Moors ruled parts of Spain and Portugal, teaching science, medicine, and architecture. The Europeans learned under them, studied their texts, borrowed their systems, even copied their styles. But once the Moors fell, Europe faced a mirror it couldn't stand. The people they had learned from were now labeled as infidels and outsiders. To erase the shame, Europe flipped the script, painted itself as the teacher, Africa as the pupil. That fear bled into religion. European theologians saw African kingdoms practicing Christianity and Islam before them and panicked. If Africans were already spiritual, already advanced, then the European mission to civilize the world had no purpose. So they weaponized faith, turned salvation into a sales pitch, turned light versus darkness into a racial metaphor, and it worked for centuries, but the cracks kept showing. European traders noticed Africans using compasses and maps centuries before discovery. They saw astronomers tracking planetary motion from Timbuktu observatories. They saw healers using herbs that modern pharmacology still relies on. It scared them because it exposed their lie. If the uncivilized already knew science, then what was Europe selling? That's why they burned libraries. Sankar, Gao, Zhen, centuries of knowledge turned to ash. Not by accident, on purpose. Because those manuscripts held the proof that Africa wasn't in the dark. Europe was not, you see. Fear is the foundation of domination. Europe feared the day Africa would remember itself. Because memory leads to unity, and unity leads to power. That's why they broke families, tribes, and languages during slavery. They knew that one word in Wolof, one drumbeat in Yoruba, one prayer in Congo could wake an entire people from hypnosis. Even today, the system runs on that same fear. Every time Africa rises, every time the diaspora connects, the world shakes. Look at history. Every black movement that preached self-knowledge was targeted. Haiti, Garvey, Panthers, civil rights. It's not the guns that scare them. It's the memory. Because deep down, Europe knows something it can't admit. The teacher is still alive. The descendants of the Moors, of Mali, of Kemet, of Congo, they're still here, speaking, building, creating. And the minute we stop believing their version of history, their control dissolves. That's what they're afraid of, not rebellion, but recognition. The day black people see themselves not as victims of history, but as authors of it. So ask yourself, if fear built the empire, what happens when the fear flips sides? What happens when Africa stops flinching and Europe starts remembering who taught it how to stand? Before there was a Socrates, there was a Tahotep. Before Aristotle scribbled his philosophy, African priests in Kemet were teaching Mat, the balance of truth, order, and justice, thousands of years earlier. Greece didn't invent wisdom. It translated it. And badly, when the Greeks came to Egypt, they didn't discover civilization. They studied under it. The temples at Thebes, Memphis, and Heliopolis were universities long before Plato ever picked up a scroll. African scribes were decoding the stars, measuring the Earth's circumference, writing moral codes that became the foundation of law. They weren't guessing. They were documenting what they already knew. Europe's so-called Enlightenment was really just Africa's afterglow. Pythagoras learned geometry from Egyptian priests. That's not rumor, it's recorded. The word alchemy, the mother of chemistry, comes from alchem, meaning of Kemet. Even Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, studied African healing traditions long before he wrote his oath. The Egyptians were performing surgeries while Europe still prayed away disease. Timbuktu was another classroom for the world. The University of Sankar held tens of thousands of manuscripts, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, even advanced chemistry. West African scholars were calculating planetary orbits, discussing human anatomy, and trading medical texts across the Sahara while European doctors were still using leeches. The irony? Those same texts were later taken to Europe, translated into Latin, and passed off as new discoveries. But it wasn't just science. It was soul. African civilizations taught the world about community, Ubuntu, I am because we are. That concept shaped early Christian thought and even echoes in American democracy. The idea that society thrives when its people do. That's African philosophy at work. You see, the African mind didn't separate science from spirit. To know the universe was to know yourself. That's why their temples were aligned with the stars, their architecture built with sacred geometry. They understood frequency, vibration, energy, things modern physics is just catching up to. And still, history books act like Africa was sitting in the corner, waiting for Europe to discover light. That's the trick. They erased the teacher, crowned the student, and called it progress. But the receipts are everywhere. African blueprints are in the DNA of modern civilization, from the columns of the White House to the mathematics behind engineering and navigation. The very compass that guided Columbus originated in Mali. The star maps he followed, copied from Moorish charts based on African astronomy. So when people say Western civilization, what they really mean is African innovation with European branding. The saddest part? We were taught to admire the copy and forget the original. To worship Greek gods that came from African myths. To quote European philosophers who quoted African sages. To celebrate progress that began in kingdoms our ancestors built. But here's the twist. You can't kill truth. You can only bury it for a while. And now the soil's cracking open. Black scholars, archaeologists, and storytellers are digging up what they tried to hide. The world is finally seeing what was always there. The blueprint didn't come from Europe. It came from us. So if Africa taught the world, who taught America? Because what if the same people who educated Greece, who civilized Spain, who guided exploration, also shaped the birth of the so-called New World? What if America's roots are tangled deeper in Africa than they ever told you? They never wanted you to know that pharaohs looked like you. Dark skin, broad features, royal blood running through veins that built nations. When they talk about Egypt, they talk about the pyramids, but not the people who built them. They act like civilization appeared out of thin air, not from black hands and African minds. Those black pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were scientists, engineers, prophets, men and women who saw leadership as sacred duty, not ego. Think of Taharka, the Nubian king from Kush, down in what's now Sudan. He ruled Egypt at its peak, fought off empires, and built monuments that still stand. The Bible mentions him by name, but you won't see his face in Sunday school. Because he was black, and that breaks the narrative. You ever wonder why Hollywood never shows Moses or Joseph looking African, even though they lived in Africa? Why every Egyptian in those movies looks like they just left a Roman spa? That's not coincidence. That's control. Because once you realize the prophets, pharaohs, and chosen people look more like you than like Europe, their whole power structure starts shaking. Let's talk about that for a second. The word Kushite, it's not just a region. It's a bloodline. The Kushites ruled from the south, pushing north into Egypt, merging two worlds. They brought new architecture, new religion, new math. These weren't outsiders. They were Africa expanding itself. They saw no difference between Nubia and Kemet. To them, it was one civilization, one flow of culture, one shared spirit. And that same lineage traveled. Those bloodlines, through trade, migration, and later, the forced voyage of slavery, made their way west. Through the Moors, through Mali, through the kingdoms that touched the Atlantic. When black bodies crossed the ocean, so did royal DNA. That's what America doesn't like to admit. The descendants of kings were enslaved here. The children of prophets were branded as property. People who once wore crowns were forced into chains. And when you carry that kind of ancestral memory, even buried deep, it shows. That's why the rhythm of Africa never died here. It turned into gospel, blues, jazz, hip-hop, royal expression in disguise. Look at the biblical stories reinterpreted by the enslaved. Moses freeing his people? That wasn't just faith, it was coded memory. The spirituals, the preaching, the fire. It was ancient African prophecy resurfacing in a new form. The message was the same. We've been chosen before. We'll rise again. And maybe that's why the world tried so hard to rewrite the Bible in Europe's image. Because the oldest Christian texts from Ethiopia show black saints, black apostles, black Christ imagery. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Africa, talks about angels of fire and faces of bronze. That's not a European story. That's African spirituality globalized. So when we talk about black pharaohs and prophets, we're not talking about myth. We're talking about heritage, legacy, receipts that trace from the Nile to the Mississippi, from temples to churches, from hieroglyphs to hymns. They hid it because it proves something they fear most, that black people didn't start from slavery. We started from divinity. And if you knew you came from gods, what would chains mean to you then? Europe calls it the Dark Ages. That's a cute label if you like fairy tales. Dark for who? Not for Africa. While Europe was collapsing into feudal chaos, the Moors, North African Muslims of Berber and Arab descent, mostly black, were running libraries, universities, hospitals, and cities that made Europe's capitals look like dirt villages. They weren't just surviving, they were teaching. Cordoba had 70 libraries, one of them holding 400,000 manuscripts. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, all thriving under Moorish rule. Algebra? A Moor gave it its name. Optics? A Moor wrote the book. And the Europeans? They were copying. Every scientific breakthrough they later claimed, borrowed from African knowledge carried through Moorish scholarship, and it wasn't abstract. The Moors built bridges, roads, irrigation systems, and hospitals that functioned better than anything in Europe at the time. Cities under Moorish control were clean, safe, and culturally rich. Music, literature, philosophy, all infused with African intellect and rhythm. Europe had forgotten how to read, and the Moors reminded them. When the Reconquista forced the Moors out of Spain, Europe panicked. They lost the light. Entire knowledge systems threatened to vanish. But here's the kicker. The Moors didn't just vanish. They left seeds. Engineers, scholars, and traders fled north, south, and west. Some crossed the Mediterranean. Others eventually reached the Americas as explorers, traders, and captives. Their fingerprints are everywhere, from navigation techniques to crop cultivation, from urban planning to legal systems. And that's the problem Europe faced. African genius couldn't be erased. Even when enslaved, African knowledge survived, hidden in plain sight in the Americas. The Gullah people, rice cultivation experts, were descendants of West African kingdoms that traded with the Moors. They built systems and crops in South Carolina and Georgia using methods their ancestors perfected for centuries. Europe didn't just fear African strength, they feared memory. Because knowledge leads to power. And the Moors carried Africa's memory across continents. Architecture, medicine, mathematics, navigation, and strategy, all African in origin, saved Europe from intellectual collapse. And yet, when history books were written, it was Europe rose from the Dark Ages, as if the Moors never existed, even the Renaissance. A rerun of Moorish brilliance. Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo borrowed from knowledge the Moors preserved: algebra, astronomy, engineering. The textbooks call it European ingenuity, but the receipts are clear. Black Moors rebuilt Europe when it was falling apart. And the world forgot. Ask yourself, if the Moors saved Europe, then who really built the foundation for the modern West? And if their descendants helped plant the seeds in America, what part of our country is built on African genius that's still erased? Because understanding that changes everything. America wasn't built in isolation, it was transplanted, nurtured by stolen knowledge, and watered by enslaved hands who remembered home. They didn't just ignore Africa, they painted over it. Literally. Every monument, every portrait, every textbook became a tool to erase black presence. History wasn't just written. It was curated to make Europe the hero and Africa the footnote. Look at Egypt. The pharaohs? Dark-skinned. Artifacts? Bronze, gold, alive with African identity. European explorers couldn't handle that, so they repainted them in sketches, statues, and films. Suddenly, the rulers were light, the queens pale, the architects mysterious foreigners. Cleopatra, recast as a Mediterranean icon, erased her African bloodline entirely. It was a deliberate lie so powerful that even scholars hesitated to challenge it. Benin's bronzes, masterpieces centuries ahead of Renaissance art, were looted and sent to European museums. The story told to the public: unknown creators, never black African kings. Every artifact stripped of identity became a tool for cultural theft. The genius remained, but the credit vanished. Even written records were tampered with. Timbuktu's manuscripts, thousands of years of scholarship, were ignored, destroyed, or hidden. When Europeans finally acknowledged African scholarship, they framed it as borrowed knowledge, as if Africans were only custodians, not creators. They made Africa's brilliance ancient, untouchable, dead, so the living descendants wouldn't claim it. Colonial textbooks did the same in the Americas. African contributions to science, agriculture, governance, and culture were minimized or erased. Slave narratives were sanitized to focus on suffering, not ingenuity. Africans became laborers, not leaders. Primitive, not powerful. And when resistance arose, it was framed as rebellion or riot, never strategy informed by ancestral knowledge. This whitewashing wasn't just history, it was psychological warfare. By controlling the past, they controlled the present. If people forget their roots, they forget their rights. If they erase the proof of African intelligence, the myth of European superiority holds. That's why even today, so many Americans believe civilization sprang from Europe, not Africa. Art, architecture, religion, literature, all rewritten to suit the narrative. Churches painted European saints over African prophets. Music and rhythm stripped of origin, recast as folk or primitive. And in classrooms, Africa was taught as a place that needed saving, instead of the source that had already saved civilizations. But here's the key. Whitewashing can only hide what's visible. African culture survived underground, in the songs, in the fields, in the rituals, in family traditions. The blueprint couldn't be destroyed. It just mutated, waiting for recognition. Ask yourself, if history was rewritten so meticulously, what else have we been told that's backwards? What truths about America, Europe, and the diaspora are still buried, waiting for someone to trace them back home? Because every artifact, every manuscript, every song is a breadcrumb. And the trail leads straight to Africa. They told you Columbus discovered America. That's cute. But the truth? Africans were already mapping the Atlantic, planting crops, and navigating coastlines centuries before 1492. The evidence isn't in myths, it's in ship logs, oral histories, and the very soil of the Americas. The Manding, the Malians under Mansa Musa's successors, had maritime fleets that crossed the Atlantic. Leo Africanus, writing in the early 1500s, described African navigators reaching islands in the Caribbean long before Europeans. And when you dig into archaeology, rice paddies in South Carolina match West African techniques so closely that scientists call it a direct transplant. Africans didn't just survive in the New World, they were shaping it. Then, there's the Gullah, the language, crops, and water management systems they brought from Sierra Leone and Senegal aren't coincidental. They recognized landscapes, adapted their agriculture, and even re-engineered lowlands to grow rice like they did back home. That knowledge was the backbone of the Southern economy. Without it, the plantations wouldn't have thrived. Let's not ignore the spiritual map either. Africans brought religious structures, cosmology, and social systems. Communities formed along rivers and swamps that mirrored African settlements, allowing them to maintain cultural continuity. They weren't lost. They were hiding in plain sight, planting the seeds of survival. And here's the kicker. Oral histories in the Americas tell of black settlements predating European towns. Some Native American nations recount encounters with African sailors or warriors along the coasts long before Jamestown. Legends of dark-skinned people teaching agriculture, trade, and metalwork are everywhere if you know how to listen. Ask yourself, why would these traces be ignored or dismissed? Because acknowledging them destroys the narrative of European discovery. It rewrites the story. Africa didn't just influence America through slavery. It was already shaping it long before colonists arrived. And when you connect these dots, the next revelation becomes obvious. The inventions, the crops, The navigation skills, so much of early America's survival depended on African knowledge. They weren't just contributors. They were the foundation. So here's the question that flips everything. If Africans were in the Americas before Columbus, then what other histories of origin, invention, and influence have we been sold lies about? Africa invented the blueprint. And when Europe arrived, they didn't invent, they stole. Every major innovation they claim as their own often has African fingerprints. The compass, algebra, advanced metallurgy, architecture, medicine, all African firsts. And when these ideas reached Europe, the credit disappeared. Take navigation. African sailors had already mapped the Atlantic. They knew currents, wind patterns, star routes. Columbus didn't stumble into the Caribbean by luck. He followed paths charted by Africans generations before him. Yet European textbooks give him the glory. The discovery is framed as innovation, not theft. Agriculture was another battlefield. Rice cultivation in the American South? A direct transfer from West African knowledge. Enslaved Africans reconstructed irrigation, planting schedules, soil rotation, systems Europeans had never seen. Indigo, cotton, yams, all crops American plantations depended on were managed using African techniques. The economy of the South literally ran on stolen labor and stolen medicine too. African herbalism became the backbone of survival in the Americas. Yellow fever, malaria, scurvy, diseases that decimated Europeans, were mitigated by remedies Africans carried across the ocean. Yet when white colonists survived, they credited themselves with ingenuity, erasing the African doctor's role. Martial skills? Africans brought combat systems that influenced the Americas, from slave rebellions to street defense. The martial art of capoeira in Brazil, knife fighting in the Carolinas, even strategic knowledge and uprisings like the Stono Rebellion, all African in origin. They turned resistance into survival, even technology. Bricklaying, metalworking, carpentry, everything that built plantations and early American cities often came from African expertise. And when Europe rebuilt after the Dark Ages, they were using African techniques stolen from the Moors. They called it progress. We call it theft. Ask yourself, if the foundation of European innovation was African, and the building of America depended on it, then who truly invented civilization as we know it? The next step is mind-bending, because some of these innovations were spiritual, not just material. African cosmology, mathematics, and ritual carried information coded into daily life. Music, architecture, even farming. It was impossible to erase fully. And that knowledge survived in the diaspora, waiting to awaken. So when we talk about stolen innovation, it's not just credit. It's power, its identity, its culture, its survival. The enslavers tried to take bodies, but the mind and skill of Africa could not be chained. Which brings us to the question the world has been too afraid to face. If Africans gave Europe and America the tools to build modern civilization, what does that make the descendants of those African innovators? They didn't just erase history, they rewrote divinity. Black people weren't only the builders of empires, they were the prophets, the chosen, the original storytellers of God's message. But somewhere along the way, Europe decided God had to be white and the Bible needed a makeover. Look at Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves manuscripts older than anything in Europe. They depict apostles, saints, and even Christ as African. The Ark of the Covenant? Safely hidden in Axum, but the West barely acknowledges it. Instead, churches plaster European faces on God, and textbooks whisper, "This is universal truth." It's not universal. It's colonial. Even the Bible itself was altered. Names were changed, lineages obscured, origins whitened. Cushites, the Nubians mentioned over and over in Genesis, suddenly became minor characters in footnotes. Joseph of Egypt? Recast with Mediterranean features. Moses and the Exodus? Stripped of African leadership context. The prophets weren't just history, they were coded survival manuals, teaching liberation strategies and spiritual resilience. And that message was too powerful to remain unaltered. African cosmology, interwoven with early biblical understanding, offered a blueprint for justice, law, and morality. Yet Europe reframed it to control labor, justify conquest, and erase memory. Religious control became political control. Your faith was manipulated to keep you from seeing your own power. The enslaved, however, remembered. Spirituals like Go Down Moses weren't just songs, they were coded maps. Lessons in liberation, whispers of African prophecy hidden in Christian vocabulary. Africans turned European scripture into a survival toolkit. They reclaimed the texts and made them serve freedom rather than oppression. Even today, much of this legacy remains invisible. The global church worships the aesthetics of Europe while ignoring the African foundation. Saints, rituals, and theology all trace back to African origins, but the narrative tells a lie. That's why it hurts when people deny Black biblical history, because it's not just spiritual. It's identity, it's ancestral memory, it's truth. Ask yourself, if God and the prophets were African, and if the Bible contains African strategy and law, then why has the world been told otherwise for centuries? Because once that truth resurfaces, you see that spiritual, political, and cultural power were never meant to be in someone else's hands, and the people who tried to bury it. They underestimated one thing: memory. Memory survives. Knowledge survives. Identity survives. So here's the question burning under the surface. If African prophecy and wisdom were systematically erased from the world's most sacred texts, what else about our civilization has been stolen from us? And what would it mean to reclaim it? You can chain a body, but the real control starts when you chain the mind. That's what erasure does. It doesn't just delete facts, it replaces memory with myth. You start doubting your own greatness. You start calling your history mystery. That's how psychological slavery begins. The system didn't just steal African land or labor. It stole self-image. For centuries, the world fed Black people a false mirror. Distorted, cracked, showing nothing royal, nothing divine. It taught us to worship the thief and forget the inventor. To fear our reflection. That's not education. That's psychological warfare. This is how it works. First, they erase your past. Then, they define your present. Finally, they limit your future. If you believe your ancestors were only slaves, you'll never imagine being kings. If you think your people contributed nothing, you'll spend your life trying to imitate someone else's version of greatness. That's the invisible cage. They did it in art, repainting saints and scholars until Europe looked like the cradle of humanity. They did it in religion, teaching salvation through whiteness. They did it in language, turning African dialects into signs of ignorance instead of culture. Over time, you stop hearing your own name and start answering to theirs. And that's the trick. Mental colonization outlasts physical colonization. Empires fall, but the ideas they planted stay alive in our schools, our churches, our self-image. The slave ships stopped sailing centuries ago, but the psychological cargo they carried still weighs on us. Every stereotype, every myth about African inferiority, that's the residue of erasure. It's not an accident that media glorifies African pain but hides African power. It's not random that history books teach Black struggle but skip Black sovereignty. The narrative keeps the hierarchy intact, but there's a breaking point. Because once you start remembering, the spell cracks. You start seeing the patterns, how erasure was weaponized to separate Africans from their descendants in the Americas. How every effort to reconnect, from Marcus Garvey to Pan-Africanism to the digital diaspora now, has been met with resistance. Because unity threatens the illusion of dominance. This isn't just about pride. It's about psychology. A people who know their origin can't be manipulated. A people who know their worth can't be enslaved. That's why they buried our history, not because it was unimportant, but because it was dangerous. So here's the challenge. What happens when the descendants of the erased begin to remember? Not through textbooks, but through instinct, through rhythm, through the quiet pull of ancestry? When memory wakes up, chains start falling. They tried to erase us, but we survived. Not because we were lucky, but because resistance runs in our DNA. Africa didn't just build empires, it built strategy. And those strategies traveled with us across the Atlantic. Take Haiti. Enslaved Africans, many of them from Dahomey, Fan, and Yoruba kingdoms, didn't just revolt, they overthrew the French Empire. Every tactic, every ritual, every secret meeting was steeped in African knowledge. They turned fear into fearlessness, chains into strategy. That revolution wasn't random. It was educated, organized, unstoppable. Look at the Maroon communities in the Americas. Escaped slaves who carved out self-governing towns in mountains, swamps, and forests. They weren't hiding. They were reclaiming Africa on American soil. They used language, agriculture, and warfare learned in African kingdoms. They taught each other to survive, to thrive, and to resist the system designed to erase them. Even in the United States, rebellion didn't always look like war. Africans preserved culture as an act of defiance. Music, dance, folk tales, and language, each became a vessel for history, teaching children their worth in coded ways. Drums weren't just instruments. They were telegraphs of memory and planning. Quilts weren't just blankets. They were maps of escape. The enslaved built networks of survival in plain sight. Africa itself survived. Ethiopia never fell to colonial rule. Benin preserved art and governance longer than anyone predicted. Mali's legacy in trade and scholarship rippled far beyond its borders. And every time European powers tried to overwrite African power, Africans adapted, shifted, and outlasted them. Resistance is survival, but survival is also proof. Proof that Africa's brilliance cannot be fully stolen. The enslavers may have captured bodies, but the mind, the culture, and the lineage refused to die. That knowledge surfaced in the Americas, disguised as religion, song, and community, a living blueprint waiting for rediscovery. Ask yourself, if we survived centuries of systematic erasure, forced labor, and psychological warfare, what does that tell you about the strength of our ancestors? And if we carry their memory today, unbroken and waking, how much power could we reclaim in this generation? Because surviving isn't just enduring, it's remembering. And remembering is revolution. The chains change shape, but they're still here. Modern America isn't free from the same strategies of erasure. They just look like media, education, and social conditioning instead of whips and chains. Think about who controls what you see. Television, movies, music, the news, all filtered through a lens designed to shape perception. Black people are celebrated for entertainment, but rarely for intellect, leadership, or history. Culture is commodified, stripped of context, and sold back to us. Rhythm survives, but origin dies. It's the same theft as before, just packaged as pop culture. Textbooks still sanitize history. We learn about slavery, but rarely about kingdoms, empires, and intellectual legacies. We learn about rebellion, but rarely about African strategy or Maroon societies. We're taught to admire the system that enslaved our ancestors, while our real innovators remain footnotes. That's mental colonization alive, and social psychology plays its role too. Colorism, anti-black narratives, and the model minority myth divide and conquer. Even black communities are taught to measure worth by standards that erase African contribution. We internalize the stories that were written to suppress us. Every microaggression, every stereotype, it's a reminder of who's been telling the story for centuries. And yet, the echoes of Africa resist. Hip-hop, jazz, gospel, these are cultural codes, carrying lineage, rhythm, and memory across generations. Black entrepreneurship, scholarship, and activism quietly disrupt the narrative. Every time we reclaim space, from media to education to tech, we are awakening from centuries of manipulation. Ask yourself, if the same tactics that erased Africa were designed to persist over centuries, then what does it mean when we finally see through them? When the media, the textbooks, the public perception are exposed as constructions meant to deceive. The psychological chains begin to crack the moment we recognize their patterns. And once memory returns, power follows. That's why the system fights against truth-telling today. Not because the truth is dangerous to anyone else, but because it's dangerous to their narrative of control. So the real question is simple. If we can trace these manipulations, if we can read the footprints of erasure, then what would happen if we started telling history our way? Reclaiming the blueprint isn't about nostalgia, it's about power. The knowledge, the systems, the strategies that built empires, mapped oceans, and taught the world how to govern, they're still ours. All we have to do is remember. Start with education. Learning the truth about African civilizations, the Moors, the kingdoms of Mali and Benin. That's the first step. Not as theory, not as footnotes, but as foundation. When children see their ancestors as mathematicians, architects, and philosophers, they inherit confidence, not shame. Culture is another layer. Music, art, language, cuisine, spiritual practice. These are living blueprints. They carry encoded history, strategy, and memory. When we reclaim them, we reconnect to our ancestors' intellect and ingenuity. A drumbeat is not just rhythm, it's memory, communication, resistance. A dance move is not just entertainment, it's encoded heritage. Even economics is tied to this blueprint. Enslaved Africans built economies from rice fields in the Carolinas to coffee plantations in the Caribbean. Reclaiming that ingenuity today, entrepreneurship, trade, innovation, is a continuation of what was never lost, just hidden. Reclaiming isn't just external, it's internal. Identity, psychology, spirituality, all have been colonized. When we study African history, philosophy, and spirituality, we rebuild the mind. We see ourselves not as side characters in someone else's story, but as authors of the global narrative. Ask yourself, what happens when a people no longer accept the distorted mirror? When they take the erased achievements and stand in them proudly? What happens when Africa's intellect, creativity, and power are recognized as the foundation, not the exception? The blueprint isn't just about the past, it's a map for the future. And the more of us who study it, teach it, and live it, the harder it becomes for centuries of lies to stick. That's the real power of reclaiming history. It transforms memory into action, identity into destiny, survival into sovereignty. So here's the question we must face. If the blueprint was stolen and hidden for centuries, how much can we rebuild once it's fully in our hands? Imagine waking up in a world where we never forgot, where the names of African kings, queens, scholars, and innovators are taught first, not last, where textbooks, museums, and media reflect truth, not theft, where children see themselves as heirs to empires, not afterthoughts of history. Picture an America where African agricultural, architectural, and scientific contributions are celebrated, not footnoted. Rice cultivation in the Carolinas, recognized as African genius. Timbuktu manuscripts, taught in classrooms alongside Newton. Enslaved people's ingenuity, honored as the foundation of a nation. Think about the cultural shift. Music, art, and spirituality are no longer commodified remnants. They're acknowledged as legacies of kings and prophets. Black identity becomes a source of pride, not something to negotiate. Psychology shifts, because when you know your ancestors built the blueprint, you stop doubting your potential. You start expecting greatness from yourself. Imagine governments, institutions, and media systems accountable to history. Policies that suppress knowledge crumble when communities demand recognition of contributions. The narrative flips. Africa's no longer distant. It's central, visible, alive. African diaspora communities understand themselves as continuous threads of an unbroken legacy, and then consider power. When identity, history, and memory align, you don't just survive, you shape society. You innovate, you lead, you reclaim space that was stolen. Knowledge is no longer borrowed. It's yours. Education, science, art, and governance all reflect the brilliance that never left. It was just waiting to be remembered. Ask yourself this: if we had never doubted, if the erasure had never worked, if the world had always seen Africa as it truly is, what would humanity look like today? Because here's the truth: the past isn't lost. The memory is still here, encoded in language, rhythm, science, and spirit. And every time we reclaim a piece, we don't just rewrite history, we reshape the future. Here's the truth nobody wants you to fully feel. You are the continuation of kings, queens, scholars, and prophets. Every rhythm in your blood, every story passed down, every skill you carry, it's not borrowed, it's inherited. The blueprint survived because it had to. And now it's waking inside of you. This isn't nostalgia. This is action. The moment you claim the erased history, you step into power. The moment you recognize that the world you were taught to admire was built on your ancestors' ingenuity, everything changes. Self-doubt, internalized inferiority, mental chains, they all start to break. Because memory is resistance. Knowledge is liberation. Identity is revolution. Look around today. The same forces that rewrote history still dominate politics, media, education, and culture. But every time you tell the truth, every time you uplift African brilliance, every time you teach your children what they erased, you reclaim territory that was stolen. You are continuing the work of the Moors, the Pharaohs, the prophets, and the Maroons. You are part of a lineage that refused to die quietly. And here's the spiritual part. Awakening is personal and collective. Personal, because you can't give what you don't know. Collective, because the moment enough of us remember, the illusion falls. Systems built on lies can't stand against a people who know themselves. You are the proof that Africa's light never dimmed, even under the darkest oppression. So ask yourself, what happens when every black mind in America and the diaspora stops doubting its own heritage? What happens when we embrace the power of the ancestors fully, in education, in leadership, in culture, in economy, in spirit? The answer isn't theoretical. It's happening now. From classrooms to streets, from entrepreneurs to artists, from scholars to everyday people, the memory is waking. And once fully awake, nothing, no textbook, no museum, no stereotype, no system can erase what you finally see with your own eyes. You were never small, never missing, never less. You were always the blueprint. And the world has been playing catch up ever since. So this is your invitation. Remember, reclaim, rise. The history they tried to bury is the power you carry. The ancestors are waiting. The future is yours. The question isn't whether the truth can be found anymore. The question is, are you ready to see it and live it?